If inflation stopped tomorrow, the system would collapse. For your entire life, you have been told that inflation is a thief. You see it in the rising price of bread, the surging cost of rent, and the shrinking power of your paycheck. You have been trained to view stable prices as the ultimate economic goal, a return to a world where a dollar is always a dollar. But today, on Finance Through Time, we are peeling back the curtain on a terrifying structural truth that the architects of the global economy never want you to face. The world we have built since the mid-20th century does not merely tolerate inflation, it requires it to breathe. Inflation is not an accident of the market. It is the oxygen that keeps a $315 trillion mountain of debt from suffocating the planet. If the gears of rising prices ever truly ground to a halt, the very foundations of your bank, your government, and your future would shatter into dust. To understand why the system fears stability more than theft, we have to look at the anatomy of the global debt mountain. Today, the total debt owed by governments, corporations, and households exceeds $315 trillion, nearly 3 times the size of the entire global economy. This isn't just a number on a spreadsheet, it is a claim on the future labor of every human being alive. But here is the secret of the ledger. This debt was never designed to be repaid in full with money of the same value. It was designed to be melted away. Inflation is the silent partner of the borrower. Every year that prices rise, the real value of what is owed decreases. If you owe $1 million and inflation runs at 10%, the weight of that debt feels 10% lighter next year because you are paying it back with cheaper units of currency. Governments, the world's largest borrowers, are addicted to this mechanism. They use inflation to quietly erase their mistakes and fund their empires without having to raise taxes through a visible vote. History provides the cold proof of what happens when this oxygen is cut off. In the early 1930s, the world experienced the opposite of inflation: deflation. Prices didn't rise, they fell. To the average person, this sounded like a blessing. Bread was cheaper, clothes were cheaper, life was becoming affordable. But for the financial system, it was a death spiral. When prices fall, debt becomes heavier every single day. If you borrowed $100 yesterday and the value of money rises tomorrow, you now owe more real value than you originally received. This is the deflationary trap. In the 1930s, as money gained value, nobody wanted to spend it. Why buy a car today if it will be cheaper next month? Why invest in a factory if the goods it produces will lose value before they hit the shelf? The economy froze. Trade stopped. Banks failed by the thousands because the collateral they held, the land and the buildings, was losing value faster than the loans could be serviced. The system didn't just slow down, it suffered a complete cardiac arrest. The terror of that collapse changed the DNA of global finance forever. By the end of World War II, policymakers realized that a debt-based economy cannot survive without a constant upward push on prices. They transformed inflation from a fear into a tool. They targeted a healthy 2% rate, a number just high enough to keep the debt melting, but low enough that the public wouldn't notice the slow-motion heist of their savings. The 2% target is not a sign of health. It is the minimum required dosage to keep the debt shark swimming so it can keep breathing. If inflation hits 0, the shark stops. If it turns negative, the shark dies. This is why central banks like the Federal Reserve or the European Central Bank react with absolute panic at the first sign of falling prices. They aren't trying to protect your grocery bill. They are trying to protect the solvency of the global banking architecture. This transition into a permanent inflationary state was finalized on August 15, 1971. When the dollar was severed from gold, the last physical anchor on the money supply was cut away. Money stopped being a measure of work already done and became a pure instrument of policy backed by nothing but confidence and debt. From that night forward, we entered the era of the debt standard. Since money is now lent into existence by commercial banks, every new dollar in the system is born as an obligation to pay it back with interest. But where does the extra money to pay that interest come from? It has to be printed. The system requires a perpetual expansion of the money supply just to prevent a mass default on the interest. This is the mathematical cage we live in. We must create more currency today to pay for the debt of yesterday, ensuring that the currency of tomorrow is worth less by definition. If inflation ever stopped, the salary lag that keeps you running on the treadmill would vanish, but so would the credit that funds your world. Your boss wouldn't be able to wait months to give you a raise while prices climb, but more importantly, your bank would not be able to survive as the value of its loans became unpayable for the masses. We have built a civilization that is functionally a high-altitude aircraft that can only stay in the air as long as it maintains a certain speed. That speed is inflation. If we slow down to look at the view, to achieve true price stability, the plane stalls and falls out of the sky. The elite know this. They don't save the currency, they own the assets that benefit from the flight. They own the land, the infrastructure, and the monopolies that rise in value as your savings melt. You are told that inflation is a natural cycle, like the weather. It is not. It is a structural requirement for a world that has borrowed more time than it can ever produce. The system loves the borrower and punishes the saver because the borrower is the engine of expansion, and the saver is a drag on the machine. As we stand on this $315 trillion mountain, the question is no longer whether we can stop inflation. The question is how long we can keep the air thin enough to keep the climb going. Once you realize that the stability you crave would actually be the catalyst for the collapse of everything you rely on, you start to see the true nature of your financial prison. You aren't just a worker, you are a unit of energy in a system that must consume your future value just to stay upright today. If part 1 showed you why inflation is the oxygen of the system, part 2 is the autopsy of what happens when that air is sucked out of the room. We have been conditioned to believe that price stability is the ultimate virtue, but in a world built on the architecture of infinite debt, stability is actually a death sentence. If the inflation rate hit 0 tomorrow and stayed there, the $315 trillion mountain of global obligations would instantly transform from a manageable burden into a solid wall of ice. The silent melting of debt would stop, and the real weight of every mortgage, every government bond, and every corporate loan would double in terms of the labor required to pay it back. The financial system is not a static building. It is a high-speed projectile that depends on the friction of rising prices to maintain its trajectory. If that friction disappears, the projectile doesn't just slow down, it falls out of the sky. To understand why the on-first ones at the top of the pyramid fear zero inflation more than anything else, we must look at the refinancing trap. In the 21st century, debt is no longer designed to be repaid, it is designed to be rolled over like a permanent subscription. The United States, Japan, and the European Union do not plan to clear their balance sheets. They issue new bonds to pay off the interest on old ones. This rhythmic heartbeat of capitalism only works if the currency being used to pay back the debt is worth less than the currency that was originally borrowed. Inflation is the lubricant that allows the gears of refinancing to turn without snapping. If prices stop rising, the rent charged for stability becomes too high for the system to pay. Governments would be forced to choose between massive tax hikes that would trigger revolution or an outright default that would vaporize the global banking network in 48 hours. This is why central banks have become the digital alchemists of the modern era. When the natural heartbeat of the economy slows, when people stop consuming, or when technology makes things too cheap, the alchemists step in with quantitative easing. They type numbers into a ledger and conjure trillions of dollars to force the inflation needle back up. They are not trying to help you afford your groceries. They are trying to prevent the great stall. They understand that if the velocity of money drops to 0, the interest on that $315 trillion will consume the planet's entire productivity. They manufacture inflation as a life support system for a debt-laden empire that has borrowed more time than it can ever produce. But there is a darker layer to this alchemy. As we move deeper into the era of digital permissions, the gatekeepers are preparing for a world where they no longer have to pray that you spend your money to keep the fire burning. They are building central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs. Imagine a world where, if inflation stops, the state can simply apply a negative interest rate directly to your digital wallet. They could program your money to lose 1% of its value every month if you don't spend it by a certain date. The silent tax of inflation would be replaced by an automated confiscation, ensuring that the debt shark keeps swimming even if the public tries to save. This is the endgame of the debt standard, a system where your wealth is a variable managed by an algorithm to ensure the solvency of the institutions that rule you. History tells us that when a civilization reaches this stage, where it must choose between the destruction of its currency or the collapse of its social order, it is already standing on the edge of a reset. We saw this in the final decades of the Byzantine Empire, where the gold solidus was stretched so thin that it lost its status as the world's reserve, leading to a fragmented economy and eventual conquest. We see the rhymes of it today in the way nations are quietly stockpiling the one asset that the alchemists cannot print or delete: gold. Central banks are currently buying bullion at the fastest pace in half a century. They are hedging against the very system they manage, building a foundation of reality while they sell you an illusion of paper and code. They know that when the debt mountain finally collapses under its own weight, the only thing that will survive is what has intrinsic value independent of the state's promises. So, how do you position yourself for the impact? The answer is to stop measuring your success by the scoreboard the system provides. Real wealth is not found in a bank balance that requires the perpetual theft of inflation to stay upright. It is found in productive land, the original ledger that has outlasted every paper empire in history. It is found in specialized skills that the world will always need, regardless of whether the currency is the dollar, the yuan, or a digital token. It is found in tangible commodities that hold utility in the real world. Most importantly, it is found in the sovereignty of your own time. True freedom is the ability to walk away from the treadmill of consumption and debt without falling into the void. The architects of the system will keep the printing presses running until the ink runs out, because the alternative is a cardiac arrest they cannot survive. They will tell you that a little inflation is healthy, while they use it to quietly erase the debts they ran up in your name. They will promise stability while they manufacture volatility. But once you understand that the system needs your savings to melt to keep itself alive, you gain the power to choose what you hold. You are not a victim of the economy. You are a participant who has finally seen the rules of the house. If the system collapses when inflation stops, what does that say about the system you are working for? In the next episode, we go even deeper into that illusion. You don't own money? You rent it? Because money expires. Assets don't. History has answers. I merely show you where to look. And if this deep financial journey has given you a new perspective, like the video and subscribe, because the real story begins the moment you recognize the system you are living inside.